The perils of drinking a hot liquid while wearing glasses. Hi, welcome, come on in. My name is Aoife and today it's time for a book and a brew. So I'm going to tell you about 3 books that I have recently read and I'm going to have a cup of tea with me while I do so. And today's tea is a kind of a forest berries one. It's got like blackberries and blackcurrants and raspberries in it, and I think it is the perfect autumn drink. So 3 books to get through. All of them are written in verse. Let's get started. So the first book that I'm going to talk to you about is The Black Flamingo by Atta, and this is the one that I actually read the most recently. I finished this one in the middle of September. So this is about Michael, who is half Greek, half Jamaican, and he lives in London with his mother and his sister's father, who is not his own dad. You kind of follow Michael from when he is maybe 7 or 8, and you follow him throughout his life until he goes to university. That is something that I really enjoyed about this book, that you kind of go with Michael throughout his whole life. It's kind of like the film Boyhood, in that you find out so much about him just even from the start of the book. Like, it starts with, I was born on October 31st, 1999. That is something that I really enjoyed, following Michael throughout his whole life and experiencing everything that he is experiencing with him and kind of growing with him throughout the book. When Michael is about 7, his sister arrives and they get on really, really well. And that's something that I also like. I like reading about sibling relationships where the relationship is pretty good, where they get on really well together. Unfortunately, there were some times where Michael and his mother didn't get on very well. He doesn't really have a big relationship with his father's family, who are all Jamaican. He doesn't really have a relationship with his mother's family, who are all Greek Cypriot, because he doesn't really speak Greek, so he can't really communicate with them. And that's also something that I have a lot of experience with, because I don't speak German as well as my in-laws do, so I can't really communicate with them as well all the time. You also get a kind of an insight about Michael's friends. So there is a girl called Daisy and there is a guy called Kieran, who are 2 of his friends from like his school years. I think they meet when they're in like upper primary school, lower secondary school years. They have quite a lot of arguments and they have quite a lot of disagreeing views, and you kind of see where these viewpoints are kind of too different for us to stay friends. And whether or not they get back to seeing each other later on in life, whether or not they kind of rebuild the friendship, that is something that is really important, that I think is really important to discuss in books, where if you and your friends have such opposing views, at what stage of the friendship and at what stage of the relationship do you say this is too polar for us to kind of keep anything viable here? I really liked this book overall. It's got a little bit of multimedia in it, in that there are, if I can find any, there are like some texts halfway through the, like dotted throughout the book, which I thought was a really great addition to the book, because it's another really interesting way of telling the story. And it makes it really relevant to teenagers, because that's what teenagers do. That's like one of their main sources of communication with each other is text message. You don't really see Michael in drag until he gets to university and he kind of discovers that part of his personality there. That is something that I really enjoyed. I really loved watching Michael coming out of his shell and realizing who he was and turning into the Black Flamingo. That is something that I think a lot of people will have gone through, and that they've kind of gone through some kind of a metamorphosis when they've gone to university. Definitely something that I am interested in reading in. I loved this book. I know that it was really, really hyped when I went into it, and that was kind of putting me off it a little bit. Admittedly, when a book is really overhyped, I kind of hang back from it a little bit, but I had no reason to worry here. This was such a fantastic book, and I gave this one 4 stars. So the next book that I am going to talk to you about is the one that I read not quite as recently. I read this one in July of 2020, and that is Clap When You Land by Elizabeth Acevedo. So I know that Elizabeth has also written With the Fire on High and The Poet X, but this was a fantastic introduction to her books for me. I really, really enjoyed it. So this is about 2 girls called Yahira and Camino. And Camino is living in the Dominican Republic and Yahira is living in New York. And what they don't know is that they share a father. Their father lives in New York, where Yahira lives, but he goes to the Dominican Republic, where Camino lives, every summer and spends a couple of months with her. while he's on the way from New York to the Dominican Republic one summer, the plane that he is in crashes and kills everybody on board. That is actually based on a real life flight that the incident happened in November 2001, which was really close to the September 11th attacks, and everybody was really afraid that this was a terrorist attack when there was just a failure with the plane. I feel like that was dealt with really well. It kind of deals with the whole, you don't know where these people's remains are. You don't know where the bodies are. It takes a couple of days for them to actually find the remains of the plane. And that is something that is definitely relevant, because if you think about the MH30 flight or the MH70 flight, we still have no idea where that is. And that was at least 5 years ago by now. So that was dealt with really well. And that is something that I think was portrayed really well as something that has definitely happened in our real lives. When their father dies, Yahira and Camino actually get to meet each other. They start a relationship on like Facebook, and then they start meeting in real life. I think that Camino had a totally different idea of what Yahira's life was really like. So Yahira is living in New York, and she is maybe a little bit more privileged than her sister would be. She does have a little bit more access to money. She does have better access to education and that kind of a thing. Whereas Camino is living with her aunt. They don't have a lot of money. They don't have a lot of disposable income. They don't really have a very good standard of living. I think Camino has this idea that her sister is a multi-millionaire and that she can offer her riches beyond her wildest dreams. And I think that that is something that was dealt with really well here too. The kind of an expectation versus reality that Camino has to face with. There is a really great LGBT rep in this book. I really enjoyed that part, and I feel like the families were very welcoming to the whole LGBT thing, but I don't think that that is the situation all the time. So I think that I would have preferred, not that I think it should be done that way, but I think it would have been a really good way to say maybe my family weren't too accepting of the fact that I was in a relationship with another girl at the start, but they have kind of warmed around to it, because I know that that is a much more realistic way that a lot of young people have come out, that their families haven't always been very supportive of that. I am going to say as well that I really enjoyed the ending, and I think that it's an ending that Camino deserved, but I'm not going to tell you what the ending was, because you are going to have to read this 4-star book to find out. And so the final book that I'm going to talk to you about today is by one of my very, very favorite authors who writes primarily in verse. And she's an Irish author. She's been like kind of like an laureate and an Ogue, which is kind of our version of an author laureate. And it is Toffee by Sarah Crossan. So this is about a young girl called Alison who kind of runs away from home. And she discovers a rundown house and moves in there, and she doesn't think that there's going to be anybody in there, but there is. There is an old woman called Marla who keeps calling Alison Toffee. So she thinks that Alison is her friend Toffee, who used to live around with her. She's a very good friend of Marla's, but Marla's suffering from dementia, so doesn't actually have a very good grasp of what the real world is. As somebody whose grandparent had dementia, I felt that this was a really good portrayal of it. It's something that happened to us a lot, in that my grandfather didn't recognize us for the last 5 or 6 years of his life. He didn't know who my dad, his actual son, was. He didn't know who any of his sons were. He didn't know who his daughter was, his wife. He kept thinking that another family was coming to visit them. So that is something that is definitely portrayed really well. Another thing about this book that makes it kind of difficult to read is that there are quite a lot of instances of what feels like abuse in this book. There's kind of parental abuse for Alison, where she is being abused emotionally by her father, and who I believe from reading the book was her stepmother, Kelly Ann. And also there seems to be some familial abuse and elderly abuse towards Marla from her son. That was very difficult reading. And it does kind of make you sit back and it does push you back a little bit. But I feel like the book as a whole was written really well. It is quite a large book. It's kind of chunky, but of course, being written in verse does make it flow really, really well. It's a book that I haven't read in about a year. I read this in July of 2019. Definitely going to be worth a reread from me. Definitely going to have to pick this one up in the future again. So those are some of the books in verse that I have read and enjoyed recently. Have you read any book that's written in verse? What did you think of it? Don't forget to like and subscribe, because I have new videos up every week. Now get on out of here.